Nothing like having the topic changed on you as soon as you arrive. If you didn't read the pamphlet, I think the pamphlet said something about being ripped off, and I don't know how you describe that, but there seems to be a lot of discussion at the moment about people being ripped off, and electricity seems to be getting its fair share of discussions in relation to that. Now, I must say I was expecting a kind of a younger crowd, but that's the problem with society at the moment. We don't have the younger crowd participating in these discussions at all. Well, sorry, the impressionable feeling younger crowd, but I was going to talk about how they maybe could feel ripped off because they didn't benefit from rising house prices that maybe a few people here have, or they maybe might feel ripped off because they didn't have free education like we had, and maybe they haven't enjoyed exploiting the environment that we all have. It's been fantastic, you know, pollute, contribute, let's enjoy it. So I was going to tell the babies just suffer, and now I can say suffer because we're here and we're going to enjoy ourselves. And we can talk about the energy market, which is actually quite an interesting topic at the moment. You know what's happening tomorrow? Obviously tomorrow we have a whole bundle of ministers. They're going to get together in Melbourne. They're going to talk about a thing called the NEG. And it's going to be a thrilling event because they're talking about something that means absolutely nothing to most people. Now, most people's eyes glaze over when we're talking about electricity. So I wanted to do is just make sure everybody understands the core of the rip-off in the electricity system. So does anybody accept the fact that their retail price bills have risen over the last 10 years or the last decade? Yep, I can see a few hands. That's good, great. In fact, they've risen by about 45%, so that's pretty bad. You'd be thinking pretty grumpy about that. 45% in real terms over 10 years, there might be something wrong. So who believes that power price increase has been driven by the price of gas or renewable energy or anything like that? So who thinks it's caused the power prices to rise? No, we're all smart here. Oh, really? So who thinks it's those terrible renewables or carbon tax that's caused the price of electricity to rise? Jesus Christ, I'm preaching to the converted here. So normally everyone basically says, yeah, those stinky renewables and those stinky carbon taxes, and it's all because we don't have wonderful coal-fired power stations. And that must be because I really thought I'd walked into a Liberal Party meeting at the moment. But actually it was wrong. But what everybody fails to obviously understand is that the electricity price that everyone's going to be talking about tomorrow on AM, you'll be listening to Fran and they'll be talking about electricity prices, actually constitutes 20% of your electricity bill. So all this gumph about the NEG and everybody talking and everybody going to Canberra and everybody going to Melbourne to talk about power prices is talking about 20% of your bill. 80% of your bill comes from other sources, and most people don't talk about the 80%. So isn't it really good? We have a whole nation focused on 20% of what's causing everybody grief and ignoring 80% of what's causing every grief. So that's the biggest rip-off, which I'd call the information rip-off, because it's amazing that the press still don't seem to understand what's causing the increase on power bills, because otherwise why the hell would they be spending their effort on 20% of your bill? So people have always asked, well, where's the other 80% and how have we been so ripped off on the other 80%? And to be honest, obviously most people here are probably super smart because we've all worked out that, you know, the younger generation has disappeared. And you probably know that over 50% of your power bill and most of the rise has been caused by network charges. But what you probably don't know is why those network charges have risen and who's allowed them to rise. So to be honest, the biggest joke is that the network charges are not caused by market factors. They're actually agreed by a government regulator. The government itself has agreed to allow your electricity prices to rise. It is a government regulator that has increased the network charges and approved those network charges. The next largest part in your bill, you'd be loved to hear, is marketing charges, marketing and sales charges. Again, they're not set by market forces. No, we don't like the market. We complain about the market for the 20% of your bill and we ignore 80% of your bill, which comes from the non-market, the regulated part of the industry, looked after by these wonderful regulators we have in Australia and the government, and they've been responsible for, in the marketing side of the business, you've had a 205% increase in marketing fees that have gone through your electricity bill, because electricity is just so sexy, you know. It's delivered by so many people and you can buy different electrons and they all get delivered in different colours. It's amazing how you can do that. But anyway, that part of your bill has grown 205%. So before anyone starts griping about electricity prices and about the neg and about the cost of renewables or the cost of coal, just remember they're arguing about 20% of the bill and they're playing dumb bunny on 80% of the bill. So you're wondering, well, how could we all be so stupid? How could we be so ripped off that 80% of the bill we don't talk about? So Rod Sims, who's the chair of the ACCC, identified the issue over 10 years ago. And this issue occurred 10 years ago when the Howard government decided to draw all of the electricity system together under a federal scheme. Because what they did is they decided we'll have a new federal scheme, we'll bring all these things together, and we'll appoint regulators who have no idea what they're doing to regulate this system. And we'll call them the AEMC and the AER, and they were flawed then and they remain flawed today. So what they do is they allow the networks to ring up the regulator and say, ring, Mr. Regulator, I need to spend a shitload of money on my electricity system, an enormous amount of money on my electricity system, because, I just need to. And you need to, under this regulation that's required, you need to guarantee to me that if I spend that money, I'll get a 10% return on every dollar I spend, whether it's completely wasted or whether the grid needs it or not. So what an awesome scenario. So not surprisingly, the networks rang up the regulator and they said to the regulator, we actually need to spend $45 billion on the network. No surprise, $45 billion. And under the regulatory rules, you have to guarantee to us a guaranteed return on that of about 10% is where it was. For every dollar I spend come year after year. So thank you very much, $45 billion, 10%, that's $4.5 billion, almost in perpetuity. What a wonderful system that is. And even better, if you don't agree, Mr. Regulator, to my wonderful request for that electricity, that expenditure that I'm going to do, I'm going to sue you because I've got lots and lots of lawyers and you're only a dumb shit government regulator. And the best part about it is I can have as many lawyers as I like, and the cost of those lawyers is a regulated expense which I get to charge to the consumer. So it's fantastic. I can gear myself up with 50 QCs and sue the government to get those returns, and every cent that I spend is actually an approved expense under the regulatory system. So that's been awesome. So for years there's always been a bit silence about this sweet rip-off, because what's happened at that stage is you had the state governments either owning these network businesses or wanting to sell them. Now, if you're going to own the asset, you're a state government, what do you want to do? You want to make as much money as possible. It's a form of taxation. So you loved this game because what it allowed you to do is make a massive return. You borrow at the state cost of debt of about 5% and the regulator allows you a return of 10%. This is a fantastic scheme. Even better, if you were thinking about selling the network business, which of course what they would do, is you would use this scheme to drive up the profits of that network business, and then you'd sell it at a multiple of those profits to make an enormous number so you could be a treasury genius. So what they were doing is basically embedding a long-term tax, which we're all paying for, into the electricity network system, and then capitalising and crystallising that in the form and whenever they sold it. Now, I am in New South Wales, so these regulatory bodies were overseen by well-known and very responsible ministers. And in New South Wales, you'd be very pleased to know the ministers that were responsible for these regulatory bodies. They were Joe Tripodi, Ian McDonald and Chris Archer. So you know, if I had my pack of cards, I'd say for Regulatory Governance 101, it's awesome. It's no surprise you've ended up in this situation. So in fact, such rip-offs are actually not new. They're a really pattern in every privatisation. So when the governments go to sell your assets, okay, to sell our assets, is what they do is they build in some form of system whereby they will enable that new owner to obtain an enormous amount of money, a profit. And then what they do is they say, okay, well, the business works out how much it's worth, and then the government buys it, and they'll make a huge profit on them, and they'll all be fantastic genius treasurers. So what they do is they sell our assets, they raid the cookie jar, they say they've created a wonderful budget surplus, and then you pay for those cookies year after year, and that's what we're doing with the electricity system. But, ladies and gentlemen, that was just the start of the rip-off, because if you thought that was fun, you wait till these assets are in private hands. So, when the regulator was approving the largest spend on poles and wires in this country's history, actually, we had energy demand falling. Not increasing, falling. So the largest expenditure arrangement was agreed in a pattern when we were falling. So we have this privatisation caper in full swing. The networks are handed to private operators. Now they're available to operate like taxing agencies and sue the government if they can't tax you enough through ridiculous charges, and also charge all the cost of suing the government to you as well for the pleasure. But even better one thing is they actually said that if the government had come up with a creative way to make this business before they sold it worth a bucket load more than the actual poles and wires they were selling, then the difference between the poles and wires and the amount they sold it for was called goodwill, because they sold it for more than what the assets were worth. Well, how did they sell it for more than the assets are worth? They created a regulatory regime which allowed them to charge us as customers ridiculous numbers, and that created an increase in the asset value. And then what they said is, well, of course, under the regulatory system, Your Honour, that $20 billion extra you paid the government for those assets also will receive a regulated return of 10%. Of course, because you pay 10% for those overinflated assets which were caused by a taxing regime that was put in place by the government selling. The government made lots of money, ergo you are still going to end up paying those assets. It's $20 billion more than the value of the poles and wires was actually sold. So the government sold those assets for higher than their actual value, because a business is valued on its cash flow stream, not on the value of the assets. If you inflate the cash flow stream, you inflate the value of the business, and then you get to charge a regulated return. So we have a system where it allows the network owners to get a very profitable return on any money they spent on new assets and recovering any asset and any costs they operate. So it was fantastic. The private sector loved this, and the con job was perfect. So this all desire came up from a view that the public sector actually can't run anything, that government went on a monopolistic rampage, because once they worked out this little caper of net present valuing tax revenue, all treasurers could become geniuses by selling anything. So they wanted competition next in the supply of electricity, because as I explained, when you plug your toaster in, you know where those electrons come from and you know who delivered those electrons. So who you're buying your electricity for makes a real difference when you turn the lights on at home. That electricity is really quite different. Sometimes it comes out squirrely, sometimes it comes around in a circle. So, but actually, truth is that regardless of who you buy your electricity, it comes from the wholesale market, and it comes through the same poles and wires and is supplied by the same network as anybody else you ring up next week. So they took a basic commodity, which is power, and then they decided, well, privatisation is great. We'll allow others to sell exactly the same thing and fight for consumers, because I'm sure that will reduce costs. So yes, I'm buying exactly the same commodity, it's coming through the same network, it's supplied by the same person, but it will reduce costs if there are lots and lots of people selling it. So somehow they came to a conclusion that all those people now knocking on your door, annoying you at home with sales and marketing and putting advertising through your door and on radio was going to reduce your power price. Rip off. Of course it wasn't. The Australia Institute had a look at the obvious cost of privatisation of this and found that staff numbers in this part of the electricity sector rose as a result of selling these marketing companies. They went from 39,000 to 60,000 staff, and sales staff in these institutions grew by 400%. And of course, sales is a regulated expenditure for which the consumer is entitled and will pay, because under the regulatory rules, that's a fair cost. So all of these costs, as a result of you getting different electrons apparently for your toaster as it comes through the electric wire, which are all delivered by the same person, are reasonable expenses for which you shall pay and will be passed on to the consumer. So what's caused electricity prices to rise? Total regulatory failure. Total regulatory failure from start to finish, and greed of state governments, or any government, including federal governments, of the way they sell their assets. Whether it be an airport, whether it be a toll road, or whether it be an electricity system, if the government wants to make a bucket load of money, they actually change the regime, increase the future cash flow, which is the future cash flow for which you'll have to pay, and then it brings them a higher price. So all this debate tomorrow, quite amazingly, even if renewable energy is totally useless and it doubles the price of power and increases the price of power twice, it'll only increase your electricity bill by 20%. So let's talk about another few of the rip-offs while we're talking about the electricity system. Reliability, is there a reliability crisis? No, there is no reliability crisis. There was a storm in Adelaide. It's amazing. You've been running power for many, many years. We don't have a problem. But as soon as there was a storm, it made a great political opportunity for people to jump in and create a great story for reliable coal-fired power. There are over 1,000 people that manage the electricity system in different regulatory bodies who actually manage the operations of the electricity system. We already have within those bodies a reliability panel that sets the reliability standards within the electricity network. That exists. So if you've been following the news at the moment, you'll hear about the NEG, and there's the guarantee section of the NEG. People have now talked about the guarantee section, and even the Electricity Supply Board said, well, we don't need to worry about that because it's not really going to be triggered. It's not really going to be triggered unless all the other powers that we already have in place somehow fail, and we're not expecting them to fail, and there'll be 7 years' notice before they fail, and then if we do fail, then we've got systems in place that will enable us to do that already under the Finkel review. So the next thing you hear about that all these blackouts. Oh, these blackouts, they're all caused by renewable energy, right? Yes, of course they're caused by renewable energy. Everything's caused by renewable energy. Well, blackouts are relatively normal because they're generally caused by the network, not by the generators themselves. But that's changing, unfortunately, and it's changing because the existing coal-fired fleet is becoming more reliable. Now, you've all heard about the terrible consequences of South Australia. Oh, those wind farms, those pesky wind farms. But you probably haven't heard that last February, 14% of Australia's thermal generators failed. Okay? Don't be fooled about the number. Sure, coal-fired power plants operate most of the time, but you generally want them when it's hot. In February, 3,600 megawatts was out of service because of the heat. These things cannot operate in high heat. The heat is growing, they're getting older, and they're running into problems. Now, renewable facilities sometimes could fail, but they tend to be quite small and quite diverse. These are massive coal-fired power stations that are going off in a thump, and they will continue to go off in a thump, and they will cause more and more grief unless you start to replace them. So we're also facing real challenges due to climate change. Realistically, I could argue about coal-fired power stations, but the problem is that they only tend to do their maintenance in spring and summer, and realistically we're running into a problem because we don't know when spring and summer is anymore. So it's difficult to take them out of service. Maintenance cycles are becoming a problem. Now, we all know that no one's going to build a new coal-fired power station unless you believe and you come from Queensland. But you would be wondering why the government would still be building and focusing on an energy system where they forecast that coal-fired power stations will be built and they'll be operating until 2070. So coal-fired power stations have an economic life of between 40 and 50 years. The government's NEG program at the moment suggests that they'll be operating until they're between 90 and 100 years old. So Liddell was commissioned in 1973, Bayswater 1984, Eraring 1984 as well. So we need to organise timely replacements for these. This delay is not allowing us to create timely replacements. We won't be able to build another coal-fired power station here, even if you would love to, because there'll be 50 people who'll have chained themselves to everything. So even if I, was not a relatively lefty, I would be saying that actually it'll be physically impossible because there is not social acceptance of this. So you can't build it, you won't be able to build it, so therefore you need to think of other alternatives. Now, when it comes around to storage, just so you understand, when Liddell closes, the lights won't go out. What AEMO says and what the Minister says time after time is if you don't deal with Liddell, the power's all going to go out, and AEMO's told me, which is the regulator. AEMO never said if you don't keep Liddell operating, the lights will go out. What the regulator said is if you close Liddell and you don't have any replacement capacity, the lights will go out. Now, the Minister casually kind of leaves the fact that if you don't build replacement capacity, the lights will go out. If you don't fill your car with petrol, you'll run out of petrol as well. It isn't really an Einstein statement here, but the press don't seem to get the other part of the statement. So in New South Wales, if the Renewable Energy Agency, the renewable energy advocate here, which was Amy Keane, she would point out that there's 10,000 megawatts of projects ready for construction in New South Wales. And Liddell's been very good. They gave us 7 years' notice of when they're going to close. The private sector's already ready to replace this. They're already building for that replacement. That's what should be happening. But the Minister leaves out the little statement which says, if you don't replace Liddell, you will run, if you close down Liddell, you will run out of power. Oops, cut that if I don't build anything in its place. So we leave that bit out of the discussion. So just talk about a couple of other things. In terms of the sales of government businesses, obviously I've talked about it. We heard this idea now that the New South Wales, I think, a deputy premier said that he wanted to go and buy Liddell and operate it. Well, that's just awesome, isn't it? Great. Yeah, we're going to buy old coal-fired power stations and operate them. It's incredible that we've actually swung around to this scenario where it seems to be the government's going to do anything. A government should not be buying or building assets itself. It should be going to the private sector and asking them to supply those services for them. So yes, Snowy I2 might have been a great idea, but if the government wants 200 megawatts or 2,000 megawatts of storage, why the hell doesn't it ask the private sector, can you please give me the cheapest option you can think about which will give me 2,000 megawatts of storage? No, it doesn't provide a chopper opportunity, okay? So you only get a chopper opportunity if you're, the Prime Minister and you want to go out in a chopper. So you have to do Snowy 2.2. You don't actually ask the private sector where there's a much cheaper opportunity there, because the private sector won't provide you with the choppers to go in. So we've got that with Adele, we've got that with Snowy 2.2. So let's not forget about the privatisation saga. So you've heard that probably part of the story is privatisations, part of it is really about the regulatory system. But you've got to think a little bit harder about what's been going on here, seriously, in terms of being ripped off. You're in Sydney, well, I shouldn't talk about this one, but the airport was sold for $4 billion. Currently it's worth $14 billion. And every year, the owners of that have been making money. This is a timely story, whether it be the ports. Now, at the ports, that's in the news today. It was in the news this morning. They've actually said, I'll sell you the port. Now, how am I going to make that asset make a shitload of money? Because then I can be a smart treasurer. So what I do is I say no one can build another port for 90 years. So that thing is the only port that can actually receive containers in New South Wales. That's what they did. Of course, that will generate more money. Of course, I'll be able to sell a monopoly for more. So then what happens is everyone argues, you can't export anything from Australia. Australia's ports are so expensive. Well, why are they so expensive? Because you put in a structure when you privatise the asset to maximise the revenue today, which means any use of that asset in the future comes at a higher price. So anyway, look, in terms of good news here, I don't know how long I've got, a couple of minutes, but not much, okay. In terms of good news here, let's just talk about where renewables are at and why I'm still very excited about where renewables are. Clearly, renewables now produce power cheaper than any other alternative. Yes, there's a bit of storage that still needs to be worked out, but that is coming down in cost. There is no possibility there's any economic chance that a coal-fired power station will be built on economic grounds. And even gas is now becoming questionable. But for most of us in the industry, at the leading edge of the industry, making power is kind of like, yeah, cool, we've done that. But we're actually on to the next thing now. It's now renewable chemicals that we're into. Because renewable chemicals is the next wave, and we've just reached that from a price point of view. So if you take renewable energy, electricity, you zap water with your electricity, you get hydrogen out of your electricity. If you mix your hydrogen with nitrogen, you end up with ammonia, which is the large fertiliser. So we're already moving into renewable chemicals. If you mix hydrogen with CO2 or CO, you end up with methanol or methane. You're now replacing plastics. So we now actually have a system where you can forget of the 100,000 years that you've been burying leaves. The sun goes onto your solar panels, it makes electricity, you zap your water, you make your plastics and oil, not a problem, all in the afternoon. Sorry, the 10,000 years of fossilisation under the ground isn't needed. It's now technologically obsolescent. Australia is in a massively favourable opportunity to capitalise on this because we have the world's best renewable energy resources. But can you get this government to understand the opportunities that we have? And unfortunately, we can't. So there's a lot to do. It's very, very exciting. Lots more to go. But, at the moment, effectively we're ripping off future generations by not making the opportunities that are available. And to be honest, all this stuff about electricity prices, it's just bloody annoying. It's bad governance and it's bad governments that have been in place year after year that have actually which has caused the situation that you're in. So think about when governments talk about making a massive profit on the sale of the asset, the private sector's not buying it because they want to pay the government a shitload of money. They're buying it because they're going to charge you a shitload of money in the future for using it. And that has been forgotten year after year, privatisation after privatisation, and we're all paying the consequences for it in every part of our business, whether it be Privatising of the health system, Medibank Private and all of that, all these private systems now offering the same insurance, whether it be the electricity system, whether it be the airports, whether it be our own ports. If they maximise their sales proceeds of those assets, it means you will pay more in the future. There's no way about it. The Treasurer at that time is a genius. The Treasurers in the future get to deal with bloody angry citizens from then on, and that's where we are. So thank you for that. In my 1 second, apparently I've got to promote this book. It's called The Oceans, Deep in History, and so there you go. So I don't know what it is, but apparently it's a cracking book. Not that I've read it, but I'm sure I should. I love the colour, it's gorgeous.